So last time we talked about the definitions of we talked about defining monopoly. We talked about how they were price takers, and we talked about how instead of facing a flat demand curve, they are now facing a downward sloping demand curve, right? So when we had a perfectly competitive situation, the individual firm in the perfectly competitive situation had a demand equal to the marginal revenue, equal to whatever that equilibrium market price was. Now we're in a very different situation where instead of having a demand that's completely flat, we have a demand that is downward sloping. Monopoly means that if there's one firm in there, there are high barriers to entry, impossible barriers to entry, and they can determine whatever the price is within reason, right? So they can determine whatever the price is according to a demand schedule. At a certain point, they price it high enough, they're going to, if they price it too high, what's going to happen, right? By increasing the price, there's going to be not that many people that are actually buying it, right? So, you know, again, it's within reason. They can't just increase it infinitely. So when we're talking about monopolies and when we're talking about their total costs and their total revenues, it's kind of helpful for us to graph them out and talk about kind of what's the goal of the monopolist, right? So we know that our total costs are going to start out low, and they're going to increase, and they're going to increase even more, and it's going to kind of have this what would that be? Convexity, right? It's going to increase at an increasing rate. So this is my total cost. And our total revenue, because of the way that our demand curve is, right? Because of the fact that our demand curve is downward sloping, our total revenue is not going to be a straight line. It's going to be a curving line that does something like this. And so the monopolist has a few different options in terms of how much to produce, right? So remember, the monopolist is going to make the profit maximizing decision, right? The Q star where the MR is equal to the MC, right? So just like perfectly competitive, the monopolist is going to be making that same profit maximizing optimal quantity choice. And we're going to talk about that for a second, but let's just talk about it just kind of conceptually using these total cost, total revenue curves, right? At low levels of output, right? So if we just say that, you know, let's say this is 2,000 levels here, and this is 1,000, and this is up here 2.5 thousand. So at low levels of output, we are bringing little total revenue, right? Because essentially at low levels of output, the quantity, the actual quantity that we're selling is low. While the price might be high, the quantity is low. At really high levels of output, you're going to start to bring in less revenue as the high quantity pushes down the market price. So at a high level of output, you're going to have a total revenue that's somewhere around 4,000, and you're going to have a total cost that's somewhere around 3.5 thousand. So you're only going to be making half a thousand at high revenues and 1.5 thousand at low, or sorry, half a thousand at high quantities. And 1.5 thousand at low quantities. And so what you want to do is you want to find the place where there's the greatest distance between these two, right? Because we know that profit is equal to my total revenue minus my total cost. And so since I want to maximize my profit, I'm going to want to produce a quantity that creates the most margin or gap between these two curves. Does that make sense, everyone? So if I do it earlier, I'm missing out on revenue because the quantity is low. If I produce a lot, I'm missing out on revenue because the higher quantity pushes down the price. So this situation, our quantity is too low to maximize profit. This situation, our price is too high to maximize profit. Or sorry, price is too low. That's a good question. So in reality, so with some very few exceptions, right? And one of them is actually Uber, which there's an interesting podcast that I'll link you all to, which talks about how the demand curve for Uber is actually observable. But for the most part, right, in the real world, the monopolist doesn't have enough information to analyze the entire total revenue or total costs. So, in other words, the firm doesn't know exactly what would happen if it were to alter production dramatically. And the key word there is dramatically or significantly, right? So instead, the monopolist and most business owners, right, often have a fairly reliable sense or fairly reliable information, not a fairly reliable, but often have fairly reliable info about how changing the output by small to moderate amounts will affect or impact. Again, the best tip I ever got writing wise is if you ever think about is it affect or effect, just write impact. Impact will always work. Don't just get rid of affect and effect entirely. So will impact its marginal revenues and its marginal costs. So at the end of the day, the monopolist is going to be, in order to find this point right here, in order to find this point where it's the maximum amount between the two, we are going to use the marginal revenue and the marginal cost. And again, we're going to use this optimal allocation rule, not optimal allocation, but profit maximization. Optimal allocation is a whole different thing. That Q star is where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. So we're going to talk real quick about health pill monopoly. So that's the one that the book talks about, right? There's a lot of monopoly behavior that happens in the healthcare industry. Part of that is because they have to recoup the losses on developing new drugs. It costs billions and billions of dollars to make new drugs, and they don't often work out. And so part of it is if we don't allow them to recoup the profits, then there might not be any more drug discovery or drug development, right? So drug companies are permitted a monopoly for so many years, right? I think it's still 7 years. They're allowed to make their drugs before the generics, right? 7 years.
Yeah, then they just slightly tweak the recipe,
and then
they get another 7.
And then they get another 7. Yeah. Yeah, so there's definitely been some workarounds to that system, right? Which used to be fairly straightforward, right? Which used to be 7 years and kind of you were done, and then there was a generic, and you could no longer count on making a lot of money with that drug, right? But yeah, there's been some new behaviors, unfortunately. Absolutely. So we're talking about health pill monopoly. And we're going to be just looking at our marginal cost and marginal revenue curve for the moment. I just want to see what colors I used to keep with the same colors. Got it. So our marginal cost is going to be our Nike swoosh. And remember that before, right, with perfect competition, we had a marginal revenue curve and a demand curve that was perfectly flat. Right? That is no longer the case. Now we have a demand curve that's downward sloping, which means that my marginal revenue curve is also going to be downward sloping. And so the way that I like to teach a lot of students about how to do incremental analysis is to think about, okay, let's start at the beginning, right? Let's say that you are producing one of these, and again, this is probably like 1 million pills or something like that, right? But just for the sake of examples here, we're just going to call it 1, right? So for that first batch, we'll call them batches. For that first batch, the marginal revenue we see is much higher than the marginal cost, right? The marginal revenue is, somewhere around $12.50. And again, this is right from the book. And the marginal cost is $500, right? So would you go ahead and produce the first batch of these pills? Yes, you would. Marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, right? Doing that is going to bring me $1,250, and it's going to cost me $500 to do that first batch. So then again, incremental analysis, marginal analysis, you can also kind of think of it as like step analysis, like you're going up a set of stairs. So you go through the first step of stairs, and then you say, okay, do I want to take that second step, right? That second step, I have a marginal revenue of 1,000, and I have a marginal cost of 250. Yeah, I want to take that second step, right? 1,000 is still greater than 250. That's going to give me $750 of marginal profit, right? At the end of the day, marginal profit is just the difference between our marginal revenue and our marginal cost. And so long as that marginal profit is positive, we're going to want to keep on producing, right? So we're going to go to the third one and say, okay, if this one, this is at 750 and the marginal cost is down to, 200. All right, what about the fourth one? Well, the fourth one, we're starting to get, closer. Maybe this is, 600 and this is still at 200. What about the fifth one, right? At the fifth one, we've got, a marginal revenue of 500. We've got a marginal cost of around 250. So we're still going to want to do that fifth one, right? Because 500 minus 250 is still a positive marginal profit there. But now when we're asked, do we want to do the sixth one? Now it starts to get a little bit interesting. Because at this sixth one, the marginal revenue is exactly equal to the marginal cost. So some of the time, students have difficulty with the conceptual understanding of why would I produce the sixth one when the marginal revenue that I'm getting is exactly equal to the marginal cost that I'm spending. So what would be your response if you had a friend that was asking you that studying or something like that, right? Why would I produce that sixth batch even though my marginal profit of it is 0. But why, right? So we're trying to kind of think, you know what I mean? Like, why am I going to do that, though? Why, you know?
Because of accounting.
Very good, because accounting profit's different than economic profit. This is saying there's 0 profit margin economic-wise. So a 0, so this point right here, right, which is going to be 0 additional economic profit, that point right there, saying 0 additional economic profit is the same as saying some positive number accounting profit. So you're going to want to produce that 6th unit because because in this marginal revenue, marginal cost calculation, you are already accounting for the opportunity cost of your time. And so despite the fact that it doesn't seem valuable because it's 0 additional economic profit, it's going to be a positive amount of accounting profit to do that last unit. Very good. Does that make sense to everyone? So it's that difference between the profit types and the fact that we're so conditioned to thinking about profit as just accounting profit. Okay.